Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. I'm Dr. Carmen Imes, Associate Professor of Old Testament at Talbot School of Theology. Today we're in Exodus chapter 22, picking it up at verse 7. Now there are verse differences in Hebrew, so if you're reading along in the Hebrew Bible, this is verse 6 and following. We're going to go all the way through verse 13 in English, and this is a section that deals with further liabilities. So this whole section of the covenant scroll of Exodus is talking about who's liable for injury, loss, or death. And today's passage focuses on negligence while safeguarding property. So somebody's given property to somebody else to take care of in their absence or for whatever reason, and something happens to the item. Who is liable for it? So this is working out the details of neighborly behavior. Verses 7 through 9 speak about the theft of any property that's being safeguarded, while verses 10 through 13 focus on injury to animals that are being guarded by a neighbor. So let's go ahead and read the first section, verses 7 through 9. If a man gives to his neighbor silver or objects for safekeeping, and it is stolen from the house of the man, if the thief is found, he must surely make restitution. If the thief is not found, then the owner of the house must be brought near the deity to determine whether he did not stretch out his hand against the work of his neighbor. In the matter of any transgression concerning a bull, a donkey, a sheep, a cloak, or any lost item about which one says, "This is it," the case between the two of them shall come to the deity, and the one whom the Elohim condemn must pay double to his neighbor. Okay, so we've already had some laws regarding theft. These are more specific cases where the theft does not occur from your own home, but from the house of your neighbor who's watching over your stuff. So how do we deal with it? Last week we discussed neighborly concern for others' property, having to do with grazing, with burning, with the property of your neighbor that you come across or find. This week, the concern is even more acute because the person agreed to watch over that property. There was an agreement between the two parties. So in the first case, if there is theft and the thief is found, then it's treated the same way as other stolen property. The thief is the one liable, and he has to make restitution. But if the thief is not found, then there's a question of whether the one who was safeguarding the property actually disposed of it, sold it off to the side, or ate it if it was an animal or whatever, it's hiding it somewhere, or if it was really stolen. So the one watching the property is liable unless they are willing to make an oath before God of their innocence. If you're willing to say, God, before God, I did not steal this property, and you're opening yourself up to divine judgment if you're lying, then your word is to be taken. Now, there's some debate about how to interpret two elements in this passage. So in verse 8, the owner of the house must be brought near the deity. Now, the reason that I translated it this way, the deity instead of near God, is because it's Ha Elohim, the God or the deity. And that one is fairly clear, but in verse 9, Ha Elohim is paired with a plural verb, which makes it seem more likely that perhaps the subject is also plural. Now, for those of you who I've already lost, let me back up and explain a little bit. Elohim is normally translated God. But the English word God does not entirely capture the meaning of the word Elohim because the word Elohim is grammatically plural. So we often use it in singular ways in the Hebrew Bible, referring to God, the God of the Bible, Yahweh, as Elohim, paired with a singular verb usually to refer to God. But it can refer more broadly to any resident of the spiritual realm. And in that case, there are lots of angels who inhabit the spiritual realm, and so they could be referred to as Elohim. For example, when Jacob wrestles with an angel on the way back to the promised land, or wrestles with God, you'll see commentators and translations waffle on this a bit. Some understand him to be wrestling with an angel, some understand him to be wrestling with God himself. And the reason for the ambiguity is that the word Elohim could indicate either party. So why not just take this as deity or God? Well, the plural verb suggests a plural subject. So then who is this talking about? The one whom the Elohim condemn must pay double to his neighbor. That seems confusing. So some commentators have suggested that this is referring to human judges who are judging on God's behalf. That is, they're in an authorized position to pass judgment. If that was the case, this would be pretty unique. The rest of the Old Testament does not refer to human judges as Elohim. We do have the possibility of this in chapter 21, verse 6, which is also in the covenant scroll. When an indentured servant wants to become a permanent household member, they bring him before Ha Elohim. So some have suggested that refers to judges there and here. It's a little puzzling to use the word Elohim to refer to humans because Elohim is a category word intending to designate someone who is a resident of the spiritual realm, and humans are not. If this was the intended meaning, it's possible that the idea is that these humans participate to some degree in the divine council, as prophets do later in Israel's history. The prophets are seen to have access to the divine council in some limited capacity. So that's one suggestion. It doesn't seem totally persuasive to me. A third suggestion is that the Elohim is referring to teraphim, or household gods. These are statues that they would put near the door of their home to represent their ancestors. I discussed this issue back in chapter 21, verse 6, when we were talking about that passage. In my view, to see this as teraphim conflicts with the clear centralization of worship and centralization of seeking guidance to the tabernacle and the high priest. So I feel like it creates problems to read this as teraphim. There are a couple of other factors that make me think this is actually approaching Yahweh. So the phrase drawing near, it says he must be brought near the deity, they shall come to the deity. That language suggests that we're talking here about God, not about humans, because that's how that language is always used. Elohim, as I said, is a resident of the spiritual realm, which makes it less likely to me that this is judges. A divine judicial oracle makes the most sense here. A person is affirming their innocence, and there's no way to prove it. We don't have any surveillance cameras or fingerprinting methods or any way of ensuring that they're telling the truth. What we need is for God to weigh in on this and determine whether this person is actually innocent. Kind of like in Numbers 5, when the jealous husband's suspicion about his wife is being taken out of his hands and put in God's jurisdiction instead. In a few places in the Bible, plural verbs are used to refer to Yahweh. So you can see that in Genesis 20, verse 13, in 31, verse 53, in 35, verse 7, and in Joshua 24, 19. So we do have precedent for using a plural verb while referring to Yahweh. And so that grammatical anomaly, although it's rare, it's not unheard of, and that's why I think it's most likely that we're talking about God here and not human judges or teraphim. Okay, moving on to verses 10 through 13. If a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or bull or sheep or any animal for safekeeping, but it dies or is injured or is captured while no one is looking, let there be a Yahweh oath between the two of them that he did not stretch out his hand against the property of his neighbor. Its owner shall accept it, and he shall make restitution. But if he indeed stole from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it was indeed torn in pieces by a wild animal, let him bring as witness the torn carcass. He shall not make restitution. Okay, so here we are moving from the realm of an inanimate object that was stolen, or even an animal that was stolen, and now we're just talking about animals that were injured or that dies under the care of the neighbor who's guarding it. The first thing to notice is that it says, let there be a Yahweh oath between the two of them. It's a really curious way of referring to this oath that the two of them make, that they are establishing their own innocence in the face of each other. And this is the only mention of Yahweh directly in the covenant scroll. We've had mentions of Elohim, which is no doubt referring to Yahweh, but this is the only time the name Yahweh is used. And perhaps it's really important at this juncture to mention Yahweh by name, because if they were to make an oath in the name of another God to establish their innocence, is that God the kind of God who is committed to honesty and integrity? Probably not. The gods didn't seem to be concerned about that, the gods of the nations around Israel. Yahweh is a God of truth. Yahweh is then the only deity who's the right one to authorize this kind of a statement, an oath statement. So if a person is willing to claim innocence before Yahweh with regard to the death, injury, or theft of an animal, inviting divine retribution in the case of dishonesty, then we can trust their word. No restitution is necessary because they are not at fault. And if a wild animal tore the animal to death that was being watched, then that carcass establishes the guard's innocence. He's not responsible for what a lion or a coyote or some other wild animal has done. So these laws promote trust overall and accountability among and between neighbors who are looking out for the welfare of each other. They're a wonderful model for us to think about how can we be good neighbors. And so I hope it's given you food for thought that we'll continue on in our study of the Covenant Scroll next week. Thanks for traveling on this long journey through Exodus with me. It's a joy to learn with you. Have a great week.